Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and when you're going to be listening to this. Welcome to this week's episode, The Africa We Want, where we talk about issues that are very important to the continent and try to come up with innovative solutions on how best we can help different countries achieve the Agenda 2063, achieve also sustainable development. So today's session is going to be picking up from last week's, where we were talking about foreign aid and conditionalities. Last week's episode was mainly focused on aid, what aid is all about, whether aid still works for Africa. Has aid worked before? Is it working now? Are there any prospects of it ever working? And if it's not working, is it because of aid itself, how it's structured, or it is a lot to do with our continent, our governments, and our people? And a lot of interesting points were raised, and it seems as if most of these issues end up being hinged on governance, accountability. So maybe I would ask Christine to just give a minute recap to emphasize on the important issues. Then we get into today's discussion, which is mainly going to be focused on the second part of the question. And the question we'll be trying to try and answer for this session is, does conditionality still work, or does conditionality work? Because with most of the aid that the continent gets or anybody gets from the donors, there are certain conditions that are attached to the aid. And the question becomes, have they worked in the past? Are they working now? Or are they going to work? So we're going to be unpacking what those conditionalities have been like, examples of those conditions, and also how the rise of China as a donor has sort of affected Western conditions, particularly with regards to democracy, human rights, and governance. So I'm just going to give it to Christian right now to introduce herself and also just give a recap on last week's discussion, emphasizing on the main points that we talked about.
Thank you, Chido, and good day, everyone. So last week's discussion, the main points that we went through were about, uh, just as Chido said, on foreign aid and is it working for Africa. Some of the main things that we picked was items like, should aid be packaged differently for Africa? Like, for instance, should we get human capital support more than actual cash given to Africa? And also, the other thing was like, other what are the reasons why aid is not working for Africa, like over dependence on aid, so that like a country that is relying for 60% of its financing for the budget on foreign aid, that's a bit problematic. As a result, what has happened is that there's not been proper development of economic laws, institutions within Africa, because, and also under development, because someone can opt not to work for the government because they know in case anything comes up, they're just going to go and get foreign aid. That was basically the main focus of the discussion last week. And this week, we will go a bit more into detail about the conditionality. So, Chido, you can start thinking about that, the conditionality, then what that means, what it just looks like. Yeah, that will get us started.
Okay. Thank you so much for summary of last week's discussion. So as we were mentioning earlier, or as you mentioned, that most of these Western actors, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to call them donors of foreign assistance. They have always attached certain conditions to the aid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like what happened was, I would say it seemed as if the some of the donors thought that the state of Africa needed intervention,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with respect to like democracy, human rights, respect for human rights, and the rule of law, respect for the rule of law. So what then they started doing, Christian, is in their loan agreements, concession loan agreements, and all these other documents, they started attaching conditions to the aid,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it would basically be, if we are going to be giving you financial assistance, you need to ensure that there is transparency, there is accountability, there is respect for human rights, and all these other things. So it then became an issue of most of these actors looking at their own version of democracy, what they perceived democracy to be, or what they perceived democracy to be, and sort of hope the same for Africa. And I think another conversation that people are not ready to have, especially with regards to these conditions, is that in some cases where recipients fail to sort of comply with the conditions, sanctions are often imposed. So you get financial assistance, right? Based on preconditions that you have to respect human rights, you have to adhere to democracy and rule of law accountability. They are more or less like political conditions, right? So that's basically what has been happening. And I feel like it's been ongoing. It's still ongoing in as much as most of these actors, I could say the conditions haven't worked. Mainly because the term democracy itself and what it actually means for different countries, I would argue that it's different. It means something that is completely different. And the rise of China has made it so difficult for these Western actors or these Western donors to actually like continue with these conditions because people always seem now to favor Chinese aid because it has got less political conditions attached to it. Having looked at that, Christine, do you think that from the discussion that we had about foreign aid and how we completely like sort of ruled out that it has not really worked for Africa, do you think the conditions have worked for the continent? Have they managed to achieve the desired objective, which is to make sure that there is accountability and democracy in most African countries, particularly paying attention to the fact that most countries are recipients of foreign aid. Most countries have these conditions attached to the loans and grants that they've gotten, but there is political chaos that goes on and rampant disrespect for human rights.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
Okay, so I think first of all you've touched on some big issues here and the political conditionalities. My first point, when you speak, for instance, on the angle of democracy, I don't know if anyone has stopped to consider whether democracy is what Africa needs, because first of all, and then this question on democracy or good governance. Who defines that? What is good governance like? And is good governance necessarily democracy? I know that's a big question to consider, and especially because democracy is the thing where the power belongs to the people, and the people vote, and the people give the power to elected leaders. But in Africa, elections are rigged, maybe just as everywhere else, the rest in the world. But the real question to investigate even is, even as democracy has tried to be enforced and entrenched within Africa, has democracy in its very self been successful in Africa? I would say that needs to be questioned, because if democracy is the people exercising their right to choose their own leaders, in Africa there's every 5 years when there's an election, the government, the incumbent government is most likely to be the one going back into office because there's rigging of elections. It's almost automatic within Africa that even someone can get into power and change the constitution and extend their power. So there's this concept of democracy that Africa has been told to reform your legal systems, your political systems. If you look at even at the concept of political parties within Africa and you compare it to either UK or US, our political party structure is not as clear. It's not based on ideology in Africa. It's not like you can point out to an African country and see these are, for instance, like the US Republicans and the Democrats. In Africa, it's really defined. So we have a system that we are saying that go develop democracy. The question is, has democracy been developed in Africa? And I would say no. And if it has been successful, possibly there's an African country that is very successful in it. I just don't think of anyone. Some are trying and some are better than others, definitely. There are some who are not, you cannot even classify them as trying, where the opposition party, where there's even no voice of the opposition party, or even where the president gets into office, he's changed the constitution, that's to the extent their term. Yes, you can see that you're electing them into office, but they will never leave the office. So that's my first point on these conditions that have been attached for years, decades, requiring Africa to have democracy. Question is, has it succeeded? And I would say that's very questionable. I don't think it has. But then also, to answer
Mhm.
your question, when you're speaking about human rights, that the
Mhm.
conditions that have been attached requiring African countries to respect human rights, that again,
Mhm.
there's, as you mentioned, like there's a case of human rights violation. Like they are so massive, they are so extensive, they are right in so many cases. So sometimes, and it starts even from something as simple as when you speak about human rights in Africa. I think
Mhm.
the concept also needs to be defined, because in some
Yes.
constitutions of some countries, someone says that within the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, you have like a right to health. Let's even
Mhm.
assume like that's like a right, and then you have a right to life also, which is maybe connected. If the right to life gives rise to the right to healthcare, but even
Mhm.
the governments in these countries are not providing any form of medical care or health because they have no resources to. So and
Mhm.
that's just looking at the clean side of human rights, where they're even acknowledging them. There are places where they don't even acknowledge
Mhm.
those human rights, But even when they're
Mhm.
acknowledging
Mhm.
them, sometimes there's no even resources to be able to meet those rights. Like sometimes you
Yeah.
hear like
Yeah.
the Western countries speaking about human rights in such a way that is almost detached from the situation in Africa. In Africa, like
Mhm.
you hear like the things almost like the Western countries are speaking about and saying this should be done in Africa, and you think that we are barely even, like, we don't even have the infrastructure itself, we don't have the groundwork itself. How can we even get there? Like
Mhm.
you're almost telling us go get the dream. We don't even have,
Mhm.
we don't have the very basics yet. So I think
Yeah. Yeah.
for the years that aid has been given and we've been told go enforce the human rights or democracy, I think that hasn't been achieved. And I think one of the reasons is because the Western countries and the donors may be quite detached from what the situation in Africa truly
You know what?
is.
You raise very important points and issues for consideration. Gonna make this a little bit political.
Mhm,
Just for a moment, if
mhm,
you may. I was actually like reading this article, and this person was making an argument that the collapse of the Soviet Union as an alternative source of aid enhanced the effectiveness of Western aid conditionality with respect to democratic reforms being adopted in Africa,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And you go to these Western donors, and you realize that from the period 2000, it's like the EU and the US gradually increased democracy aid
mhm,
and used sanctions and developed a range of instruments to support political reform in Africa, right?
mhm, mhm,
Notwithstanding that most of these actors have been responsible for the political setup in most African countries. Like, they were the colonizers, they left, and then they felt like they were then responsible for how the political outlook of Africa is supposed to be like, right?
mhm,
I'm trying to make you understand something, because if you look at most of the very prominent actors
mhm,
with regards to foreign aid that has got political conditionalities, especially in the EU. I'm sorry, this is not my thinking or my writing. I just got it from someone. They say that you've got Germany, Sweden, and the UK, when it was still part of the EU, being the champions of democracy aid. They call it democracy aid. That the government incentive tranche and all these other policies to ensure that they increase what they call the democracy aid in Africa, right?
mhm,
Which is the aid that has got democratic conditions attached to it. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly enough, Christine, you realize that France has not really been on the forefront
mhm,
for that, regardless of the fact that, generally speaking, in the EU, it's actually believed to be one of the biggest donors of aid. But when it comes to democracy aid, it seems as if you don't see it so much in the open. Could it be because of what it has constantly been accused of, particularly in Francophone African countries? You know how we had the Prime Minister of Italy pointing out that France is responsible for impoverishing Africa and responsible for not letting go some of its colonies within the continent, right? And if you look at the fundamentals of democracy as they would want to impose it on the continent, it doesn't necessarily mirror the situation that France is in with its former colonies. And then now you've got another party that's coming up on the horizon that started coming up in the 2000s. You've got China coming in. That is a completely that has got a completely different political outlook as compared to the US and the EU. What do you think about it? Don't you think that the continent itself has been found on the center of political struggles, power struggles, and it's just being ponied in situations that actually have nothing to do with making sure that there is progressive development within the continent?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation because what does you giving aid, even if I understand the concept is that you're almost like you're the one who is receiving the aid. You're almost at the mercy of the person who is giving you. And we can discuss that later because the African countries they they also are putting themselves in this position, this vulnerable position where you want to go asking for money instead of developing, trying and putting some effort to develop within the country. But the concept of aid being attached to how we run our political system, that's problematic because now this is a situation that arises, as you've really pointed out. Like, see France, like it's giving aid, it's still holding on to the colonies in Africa, it's still having the colonies in Africa pay certain amounts to them. And then here you have, and then again, not to sound like cynical about this, but or not to criticize the systems about like the democracy of the US. Like these countries,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like they are the most democratic either. Like it's not like they
Yes.
are upholding the best human rights possible. They are not, and so it's almost like
Yes.
whichever new administration that comes to the US, like if it's the Democrat who is in power, their policy forecast shifts. When a Republican comes, they shift, and with each shift, they're asking
Mm-hmm.
Africa to keep shifting. So, if, for instance, like we believe, like we need to support, for instance, the advocacy of, let's say, reproductive health, and so we want to give people rights to, for instance, abortion, and that's what the government that's in power in the US is supporting. Then you tell Africa to align all its laws because it's the democratic government in power, so that you can receive aid in that area. And then the Republicans come to power and they are opposed to this. And then again, the aid shifts. And then Africa again has to shift its focus and shift on trade or something else. And the funding for like
Mm-hmm.
reproductive health doesn't come to Africa. And then in comes China. China, the thing about China is so that you can realize like how vulnerable Africa is to being tossed about by every wind of political system that each country is running. Here comes China. China is not democratic in the sense of like US or UK as you observed.
Yes. Yes.
And it's even its economy, it's like almost like a socialist capitalist economy. Like most of their businesses will be state owned, but they're also privately owned. The government has such control even on the economy of China, unlike where there's a lot of private people running the business. China, the selling point of China when it comes to Africa is that China does not interfere with the politics of Africa. And that's
Yes.
what they say. Like they will not, there are conditions, there's no political conditions attached. They respect
Mm-hmm.
sovereignty, which I don't think these other countries are trying to do. They don't respect that you're sovereign state. In fact, this week, one of the presidents of an African country was addressing the media and telling the Western countries to keep off. And so and so you can see, like, to answer the question, what you raised is that this situation where aid is attached to conditions of how we govern Africa is a problem. And
Mm-hmm.
I think as much as African countries are vulnerable to like whatever the donors wants to be done, it's problematic because democracy in itself may not be the best fit for some African countries. Like how about and again, what is democracy? Who is setting this example
Yeah.
of this
Yeah.
great democracy that the US wants? Is US the one that's saying
Mm-hmm.
like, look at us, we're the most democratic people? Fine if they're democratic,
Mm-hmm.
but do they realize what Africa needs to get to the point where the US is? How long has US taken to be in the position where it is? Is Africa at the same point?
Yeah.
So that now the US system has developed over a longer period of time compared to Africa. So instead of, should we exercise the democracy that was in the US at the same point in time where they were, where Africa is? You understand? Like when
Yes,
like
yes.
into the US history, maybe 50 years, like should that be the position that we should be within Africa? Because we are not at the same level. We are not, our political parties are not organized on ideologies. There's a lot of like tribalism, like the literacy levels are also problematic. So I think it's a problem. To answer the question that you
You,
asked, like on this being tossed about, it's really not the
you,
best.
just to put in something to the discussion, I was reading a study that's being done by someone on transitional justice in Africa, but with particular attention to South Sudan. And it seems as if South Sudan has been getting aid and all this, but politically it's not doing well. It's not even doing well with regards to the respect for human rights. You know, uh, the question then becomes: is this really working, or it actually like these countries, the donors tend to try and enforce some of these where they've got an interest that is vested, you know. And I feel like you are right to say that democracy is, I think it's not a straight jacket, so to say. And as a continent, or not as a continent, actually every country has to look for a form of governance that works for itself. Because I remember we were having a conversation on governance and politics in Africa. Someone mentioned that Africa has got diverse political landscape. We've got monarchs, so to say. We've got dictatorships. We've got democratic government. We have everything in Africa. We have a little bit of communism, a little bit of socialism, a little bit of this, capitalism and that, right? And these countries are doing differently. So at the end of the day, we can't really say that the Western version or the Western form of democracy actually works. I might not necessarily have a problem with a democratic society, but I think what's then happening is when these conditions, especially when it comes to democracy and human rights, they are not made in a way that tries to adapt to the particular situation of any country. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Yes.
It's not made in a way that is adaptable. It's just put in a straight jacket, right? But then what people fail to understand is needs and issues in every society are different, right? Speaking of democracy, we've got countries where they don't have this democratic system of governance and it's working for them. You talk of your China, right? And going back to human rights, in some countries, freedom of expression is very important, right? But in another country, that's not really the human right that the society is so concerned about. You understand? People are so worried about socio-economic rights, the right to food, shelter, the right to water and sanitation, and those are the rights that they're worried about. For us to then have a situation where we have got, let's say, a loan agreement that says electoral rights have to be respected in Zimbabwe, the right to freedom of expression, to express oneself, I don't think that would possibly be a very important right to most Zimbabweans, because right now they're so worried about socio-economic rights. So the other reason why some of these preconditions have not worked, because they don't the situation within a particular context.
Yeah.
You need to have democracy. You need to have respect for human rights. There need to be, the rule of law. There needs to be transparency, accountability, and all these other issues. But these are more or less like straight closes. The question becomes, have they been adapted in a way to actually suit the desires of the people in that particular society? The right to housing may not be very important for Kenyans because everybody has got a house, right? And they've got decent accommodation. And they are so worried about their political determination. But then if the conditions come in the form of socio-economic rights, I don't think they achieve the desired objective. And also, when such a situation arrives, you realize that they end up not serving the purpose. They are just there, they exist, but to what end? For what means? You know. And I always like to talk about China because China has rose and made the world realize that the Western version of democracy, it's good, but it doesn't really apply for every society. It doesn't apply in every society, right? Because you have got China that has got its own system of governance and is doing well economically. So now the question becomes, because prior to the rise of China, I think there was a gospel that was trying to be shared and preached among countries that for you to actually realize development, political, economic, and social development, right, you need to start with democracy. Make sure that there is democracy in a country, the right to choose leaders that they want, and without interference and everything, right? To be able to hold people accountable for whatever that they would have done while in power. But then China comes in and says, you know what? Development isn't really hinged on political considerations because they don't have that very firm version of the very version of democracy, but they're doing well. The more reason why you realize that currently most African actors are now favoring, like you said, Chinese aid because it's not so burdened on democracy. It's not democracy aid. It's not burdened so much on political considerations. That's why I think I would suspect, when we were talking about last week, you raised the point that with Western aid, there is nothing to show for it. But with what's happening with China right now, we see roads being built, dams being constructed. For now, it's not important who is benefiting ultimately from that, whether it's for Chinese benefit or it's for the continent or for a particular African country. But I'm saying there is output.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, and
I could be wrong.
no, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think especially on the point of China and what has happened, like China, and you see like the strategy, especially that they have taken is that, and we've had this discussion I think last week or sometime on the Africa Asia Open Talk, and what we are saying is that in Africa, here's what we need for development. It can't be ad hoc. There has to be a long term plan to develop. Like for China, you see, like they have like the Belt and Road initiative. It's an initiative that was rolled out in 2013, and they had planned for it earlier. And so there's a roadmap to develop, which is despite the government that's come in power. So, for instance, irrespective of the government that's come in power, let's say Malawi, if what you are focusing on is building, upgrading the infrastructure, the road network, whichever government comes in power, we have an economic plan which we are following. So that now, when the new government comes in power, don't throw away the road network and say now we are going to construct, I don't know, the rail or something else. You have to go on with the plan so that you see it to completion. And you see, that's like China has focused on such an economic plan. And you respect them for that. They are good planners. They plan on how, on the economic strategy they have, which is a long-term plan, which they're trying to realize, and they are pursuing the economic development. And when the democracy was introduced to Africa, or when this was sold, as you say, was sold and presented as this as a solution to Africa, it might have been presented as a political solution, but was this an economic solution? Because what has come of it is you say that you have to really focus on getting a democratic leader every 4 years or 5 years. The new leader comes and then does away with all the economic projects the previous government had started. Like someone gave an example where this government was working on green piped water, the next government comes and decides to bring electricity, and the next person decides to build on the roads. And every 5 years, there are gaping holes that haven't brought in water, and then there's electricity, like underway that was never completed. So it's just all chaos in the side of the economic side. And this is a solution that was never brought to democracy. So sometimes when you look at what was presented as a solution to Africa, you want to step back and look at like why was this presented as a solution for Africa? Because even as you say, like if you're honest to the situation in Africa, right now there might the things that the US is really keen on, let's say freedom of expression, having internet as a human right, or having access to technology as technology like getting access to everyone. The reality that in Africa there's someone who does not even own a mobile phone, live alone, and they cannot afford it because and then also they didn't have a meal last night. So if I have no money to buy food, should I be is my the right that I'm entitled to the right to internet? Like at what point? Because the thing is that it's almost like the person who comes up with the conditions and thinks these are the solutions for Africa does not understand like most African countries right now, food security is the top agenda for most African countries. They cannot feed themselves. Most countries in Africa, the government is trying to like import, even when aid comes, and of course, some of it is probably misused, but like our main focus is normally to like get maybe food, buy more food. Over the COVID period, we did not even have PPE. So at that point, what is the human rights that you should be focusing on? Should you be telling me that it's fair to have internet, it's fair to have freedom of expression, but the reality on the ground is that someone who is dying of hunger will not care about freedom of expression. Their very life is in danger. And the reality in Africa is that there are communities and countries like maybe within the urban centers, the capital cities that people may be well off, but there's the remote parts in Africa where someone literally only eats a meal, I don't know once in how long. Such a person wouldn't care less about political expression. They will not even go to vote on election day because they can't make it to the voting booth. And they wouldn't even care because this person doesn't have food. Their children are dying of hunger. So when this is a system that has been pressed on Africa as the being that we will impose sanctions on you. And I think the topic of sanctions, I think we should possibly have a longer discussion because those sanctions are causing more harm for Africa. So you tell me that I'm not giving the freedom of expression, which we don't necessarily need. What we need is food. And then when I do not give the freedom of expression, you impose sanctions on me. And as a result, I cannot sell to the international market or something. So you deprive me of the very thing that I need.
Just to give you an interesting perspective, with regards to sanctions, you know, I didn't know that some of these sanctions that are imposed are necessarily not imposed on governments. Some of them are travel embargoes on specific individuals that are in government. But in as much, I think in as much as the idea is good, probably trying to force someone to respect human rights, you're not respecting human rights in your particular country. So we're going to impose travel restrictions. We're going to freeze your accounts and everything. You can't go to the US. You can't do this. It's fine, right? It's fine. But I don't think it's a conversation that we're going to have. That I don't think sanctions are working for Africa. Why do I say so? Right? Because what's happening is when most of these other sanctions are imposed, particularly on political figures, they are so interested in being in power for financial and pecuniary gain, so to say. If it gets hot in the kitchen, they would rather get the oven and try cooking from the dining room. You understand? Meaning that instead of them actually being accountable for the money that they're spending, for them to be accountable for the gross violations of human rights, they are pretty much going back to taxpayers' money, and using that same money for personal gain. So you see how then the sanctions end up having a ripple effect on the person who's probably in the rural area who doesn't know anything about sanctions. Sanctions were good. The idea of sanctions was good in a way. I can't discredit it. But I feel like it has really costed Africa. It has really costed most African countries and the citizens. Because the citizens are the people that end up suffering when in actual fact they're not supposed to, right? Somebody wrote a paper on these sanctions and how they don't necessarily affect trade. It was about trade embargoes. And this Zimbabwean lady was pretty much, I have high respect for her. She was saying, you know what? the sanctions that we talk of in Zimbabwe, they are not trade embargoes, and they don't affect how Zimbabwe trades with other countries, which then makes somebody wonder why then trade is not booming up. But then it goes back to the fact that the idea that I'm talking about, that some of these sanctions are targeted sanctions, targeting specific individuals. And these individuals, because they can't go out and have businesses in these other Western countries, they would rather take from the government coffers to make sure that they enrich themselves. So ultimately, the same person that the sanctions are trying to protect in court is the very same person who's going to suffer, because they will still not, realize socio-economic rights. The money that is supposed to provide housing, water and sanitation, basic education, is going to go straight to somebody's pocket because their account has been frozen in the US.
And I understand, especially like stopping the travel of like someone who is not respecting human rights. But the other thing to ask is that are these leaders looking to migrate and live in the US? Or are they willing to live in the African country and keep getting as many goods from it as possible? I think most of them would be happy to just live within that country and do what you say. Continue enriching themselves, continue getting the benefits of living in that country. And if they travel, maybe it's once in a while, but they are really their vital center of economic interest. The economic allegiance is to that country because of how much they want to protect there. And then also, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think we have the discussion about sanctions and whether they're working or if they're achieving the purpose they should be achieving.
Just to give you another side to it. This is from my history. If my history serves me well, during the time of what we call in Zimbabwe the UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, the Smith regime declared independence from the crown, which was from Great Britain, right? So it was a white government in Zimbabwe saying, it was still Rhodesia, saying, you know what, we are now independent from the UK. So when the Liberation War struggle was fought, it was pretty much against the Smith government, the Smith regime. When this UDI was announced, Britain was like, okay, if that's what you have decided to do, that's fine. We're going to impose restrictions and sanctions not on targeted individuals, but on Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia to be specific. So what then happened was Southern Rhodesia became sort of isolated. It was more like, you think you can do it on your own, try doing it and see how far you go. And if I tell you that most of the economic reforms that happened within the Smith regime that were actually good. Let's not talk about colonization. Let's not talk about, the racism that was rampant, the discrimination and everything. Let's not talk about the bad side. Let's look at economic development. The country became self-sufficient. It's like the government of the day was like, okay, fine, you have imposed sanctions on us, it's okay. Let's try to look within and see how we can prosper. And it's from that period that we get to know, the then independent Zimbabwe as the breadbasket of Africa. Agriculture, they started going, looking more into agriculture. And it became a situation where most countries actually want to trade with Zimbabwe because of what was coming out, the output. So look, I've given you instances of two countries that had sanctions imposed, so to say, and how they dealt with it.
Yeah.
So the problem with most of these sanctions, they're not really economic. Yeah, some of them are economic sanctions that are imposed on a particular country, but some of them, especially the ones with the most devastating effects, are the targeted sanctions that are targeting particular individuals who are in government. And those are the ones that have made most African countries suffer the most.
Yeah. And especially when I think the bigger issue I have is especially when these sanctions that are imposed is because, for instance, you're not giving a certain human rights when in Africa our socio-economic rights are so like we are so behind. Like I understand like things like countries that are engaged in things like terrorism and they want such countries want to impose like the violations for human rights from terrorists that are huge and there's actual threat to life. But then I understand those and the regulations that they're trying to have on that and the rights they're trying to protect there. But also at the same time is that the socioeconomic rights in Africa is really behind. Like you'd hear someone right now having a conversation in the COVID time, and the big discussion you hear like in the US is whether someone should wear a mask. Is
Yeah.
it working or not? In Africa, let me tell you, the
We
other
don't
day
care.
we don't care. Like, oh my goodness, like you literally don't even have the luxury to even fall sick yourself, because if you fall sick, you know you're on your own. There's no government aid. Even if you have medical care and you go to the hospital, they may not have the medicine or the equipment. Even if you go to the best hospital there
Yeah.
is in that country, they may not have ventilators. They may not have, like, the chances of you dying because of a curable disease in Africa is so high, you know. So you do everything you can not even to fall sick. So if it's a mask, you wear it. If it's like there are luxuries we don't have to sit down and debate. What's the idea behind mask? It's COVID. I mean,
Yeah.
literally here, what you're doing is that you're doing everything to survive. And in fact, you also know that how brutal policemen are in
Indeed.
Africa. So if
Indeed.
you're caught without
Yeah.
a mask, you'll be shot and die. So you're like, I'd rather just wear the mask. But other countries, you can sit down in the West, in the UK, and sit down and start asking, am I, am I being protected by the state now? In Africa, you have no
Mhm.
protection from this land whatsoever.
Yes.
So what you do is that you don't even play around with getting sick, play around with getting what. In Africa, you're surviving for yourself and you do everything you can because you know the situation in which you're living in. You can't, either the medical
Yeah.
bill is too expensive for you as a family to rent a car, and even if you have the resources,
Mm-hmm.
is that maybe the hospital themselves don't have the facilities that you need. So I think the ball game in
Yes.
Africa is so different. Someone should actually look at the situation on the ground as they are given these conditions. Because when you go back and look at it and ask yourself, why hasn't, let's even say that economically the aid has done nothing for Africa. How has it
Mm-hmm.
achieved
Mm-hmm.
the other things that the aid was aimed to help? The
Yeah.
social reforms that we looked for, the political reforms that we looked for,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
legal
Mm-hmm.
reforms and the
Mm-hmm.
human rights reforms that are looked for.
Mm-hmm.
None
Mm-hmm.
of those seem
Mm-hmm.
to be coming, like there's no outcome, positive outcome of those things.
Yeah.
There's nowhere where the US can point and say we gave US aid to this African country. And wow, look how the reproductive health has improved in that country. You can't point to any
Mm-hmm.
African
Mm-hmm.
country where you can say, wow, because of the sanctions that you have imposed, see how democratic we are.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
you can't look
Yes.
either economically, there's no output that you can see. In these other areas where the conditions are supposed to be, we can't see such a positive outcome. And by positive here I refer to like excellence in democracy, excellence in freedom of expression, excellence. Of course, I
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge that steps have been made. Women can vote. Children have a right to go to school. Like FGM
Mm-hmm.
has been reduced, and all these things have been
Mm-hmm.
done maybe because of the aid that has been given. But is there
Mm-hmm.
any excellence in any of those things? No. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's something to look at and relook at these conditions that have been imposed by the West. And now I can
Mm-hmm.
almost see why the African countries have a bit more, they are looking more in the east. They are looking more at China because for the years
Yeah.
that China has come to Africa, there's a road to show. There's an airport to show.
Yeah.
And China has never
Yeah.
asked you, are you democratic? China doesn't care.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they don't ask you, is there freedom of speech in this country before we give you this money? They don't care. And so
Mm-hmm.
as a result, there's been
You know,
some progress, you know.
yeah. I genuinely feel that this is not going to end. Look at how after the fall of the Soviet Union as this donor, people started looking west. African leaders started looking west for aid, and we now have this conditionalities and everything that we having been talking about. And now there's the rise of another superpower on the horizon in the east, and we have countries talking about the look east policy, right? I feel like even if let's say South Africa, for argument's sake, is going to rise up from being a developing country to actually being a developed country that is now it's now matching, it's becoming a superpower. We are going to end up having a look south policy where we are now looking at South Africa also for aid. So I think what needs to be broken is this cycle of codependency on aid. Whether the conditions are good or bad, or whether there are no conditions, there is output or there is not. I think we need to get to a point where this generation of political leaders and the next generation actually breaks this cycle. Because of aid, we've literally been in the same place, right? We've been in the same place. Let's now look at other solutions to achieving economic development and making sure that we get to the Africa that we want, right? We talked about some of those alternatives last week. We talked about how opening up markets, free markets, trade can actually help countries become self-reliant, because the idea is every country has to be self-reliant. The moment a country is self-reliant, it has no other source of income to probably spill and fatten somebody's pocket. We can then start talking about accountability, right? Just to, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. When you are still a child who is under the guidance and roofing and providence of the parents, you you're not really very particular with how you spend money because you're not working for it. It's money that's being given to you by virtue of you being a child. So even you can go around and shop and do all those things and not prioritize because it's not your money. The moment you start working, Christine, for yourself and you get the first paycheck and you have to buy detergent for yourself, that's the moment you realize that, oh, I need to be accountable.
Yeah.
I need to account for every penny that I get. So I feel like before Africa actually learns to be self-sufficient, we will never talk of accountability. It doesn't have anything to do with the conditionalities. It doesn't have anything to do with who is giving us money. It's this idea that as long as the money is not something that we worked for, that we were to strive for, we can't be accountable for it. We can't be accountable for it. We use it anyhow. We use it anyhow. So the first thing that we need to do is break this cycle of aid. Foreign aid must fall. The conditions must fall. When we get to a point where we don't depend on anyone, we start looking from within on how to come up with solutions. We start empowering our own very people. We start holding the people in power accountable, because then every dollar counts and every dollar matters. Well, in the interest of time, I think we're going to cut short this conversation and really put it to our listeners out there that it's important that we have a conversation on sanctions. And I think we've talked about it. We're going to open a full discussion on sanctions and how they've, contributed to the state that most African countries are in right now. So maybe just to give a summary, what is it that you have to say, Christine, about foreign aid and conditionality, the whole conversation that we've been having in the past 2 weeks? What is the takeaway? What do you think is, if there's somebody who's listening and they're a future policymaker or they're a current policymaker, right? What is it that they have to be mindful of? What is it that they take away from this conversation about foreign aid?
Okay, thanks, Chido. And I think to begin with is what you just said in the last closing remarks you made about empowering and internal development. That each African country needs to be self-reliant, because the reality is that the person who is paying your bill and they can attach whatever conditions. They can tell you to dance so that they pay your bill. They can tell you to do the jump, run, and that's what you have to do. You look into them to finance you. But if you're self-reliant, that's the only way we're not having a discussion on how the conditions ethical, how ethical are they, who should be imposing them, what conditions work for Africa. We will not be having that conversation about conditions if you're self-reliant and not looking to anyone. Otherwise, you'll be tossed about just what you say. They'll come and look south policy, look north policy, and with every policy, of course, comes with conditions. Even as we applaud China for there's a cost that Africa has to pay for that. And again, over time, we start discussing on how ethical are the silent conditions that are attached on the China law. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that empowering. But then also, I would say for now, because the African countries may not be looking, uh, they may not be looking to discard aid because it's the comfortable place, it's the warm place where you see them do nothing and just happy to stay. I think someone was suggesting, I was reading an article that someone was suggesting, then maybe the conditionalities need to be legislated, go through parliament, before you sign on a loan or before you sign on conditions, whoever is signing on it, whichever body, state government, the state department is signing on it, and can they go through parliament so that the lawmaking body looks through these conditionalities and looks at when you're being told to do this and that. Is that what the country is? Also, I think you need to be sure, even as you're empowering yourselves economically, the question of governance. What's the best governance strategy for Africa? Africa needs to come up with that,
Mm-hmm.
and each African country itself needs to look at what works for itself. And we have seen what
Mm-hmm.
we've seen, China is a totally different model. It's working for them. Let Africa come up with its governance with its own African characteristics and say, and bring
Mm-hmm.
it down to each African country and say, for us, this is what's working. It's working for us. Yeah, that's what works. So yeah, I think that's what I would say on that conversation. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Christine. You raised very important issues and you summarized it so well. I just wanted to add on to say, you know what, Christine?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we even need an African model for democracy or economic development. I don't need, we need to have a collective model as, as a continent. Each and every country has to look at the social setup, the political history, the historical background, the political setup, the needs of the people within that particular country, and come up with a model that works for those people. Because I'll tell you for a fact that in as much as South Africa and Zimbabwe share like a border post, we were very close, eh?
Mm-hmm.
It takes me from Joburg to Zimbabwe. It takes me about 15 hours by bus, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how close it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's even way, closer than Joburg and Cape Town.
Mm-hmm.
So in as much as we are that close, I we still don't share the same political history. We still don't share the same needs. The people within these countries don't share the same needs. So there is no reason why these two countries have to have the same economic, political, social models, right?
Mm-hmm.
So every country has to go back to the drawing board and actually look for what ticks for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to copy from other countries that have done well, that are doing well, but it has to be contextualized.
Mm-hmm.
My issue is contextualization. It has to be contextualized in a way that actually speaks to the needs of the people within that particular society. And I'm going to say this, you know what? I don't think that conditions have been to blame entirely. I don't think foreign aid is bad entirely. Aid has worked for Europe, right? The conditions have worked in some countries where, well, like you said, women are now allowed to vote. There is now some regard for human rights and electoral rights and everything. But I think it's also these conditions cannot be applied in a straight jacket because, like I said, countries have got different needs and different political backgrounds and histories and everything. And that has to be taken into consideration. And I think right now, 2020, and we're getting into another decade. We have talked about aid for a very long time. We have had this conversation about foreign aid and conditions for a very long time. It started way before you and I were born, and I think we have exhausted it. Let's now look for other solutions that actually work. A lot of people have said it doesn't work. Dambisa Moyo said it doesn't work a long time ago, right? And today we're still saying the same thing. Why can't we then have let's have the conversation now to look at what actually works? Let's be self-sustaining as countries. Let's open our markets. The same solutions are still applicable today. Let's open our markets. Let's empower our people. Let's get into investment contracts that have got transfer of technology, transfer of knowledge, so that we need to get something out of something at the end of the day. I think that's what I think.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much, Christian. This has been very interesting. The past 2 weeks have been amazing. Thank you for your input. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank our audience and the people that constantly interact with us on the various platforms that we have. Keep the comments coming, keep the feedback coming. This is how we make the continent great. This is how we achieve the Africa we want. Thank you.
Thank you.